I have always taken pride in my home. After years of saving, I finally purchased my dream house in Oakwood Estates 3 years ago. The neighborhood was everything I wanted: quiet streets lined with maple trees, well-maintained properties, and a sense of community that felt increasingly rare these days. My house was not the largest or the most expensive in the area, but it was mine, and I poured my heart into making it perfect. I spent weekends meticulously landscaping the yard, planting flowers that bloomed in careful succession throughout the seasons, and nurturing a lush, green lawn that rolled like a carpet from my front porch to the street. That lawn became my weekend therapy. The methodical back and forth of the mower, the satisfaction of crisp edges along the sidewalk, the peaceful hours spent on my knees pulling weeds and aerating the soil. It was my escape from a demanding work week. My neighbors would often stop to compliment my efforts, and I took genuine pleasure in contributing to the neighborhood's appeal. All was peaceful until that first Monday morning in April when I stepped outside to retrieve my newspaper and noticed something that made my stomach drop: a deep set of tire tracks cutting diagonally across my front lawn. At first, I assumed it was a delivery driver who had taken a careless shortcut. Annoyed but not angry, I spent that evening repairing the damage, filling in the ruts with soil and seed. I even placed a few small reflective garden stakes along the property line to gently discourage future incidents. Problem solved, or so I thought. 3 days later, I discovered fresh tracks in almost exactly the same path. This time, the damage was worse: deeper ruts that tore through my carefully nurtured grass down to the soil beneath. After the third incident in a single week, I knew this was no random occurrence. Someone was repeatedly using my lawn as a shortcut, and the pattern of timing suggested it was a neighbor. I decided to set up a discreet camera mounted inside my front window, positioned to capture my lawn and the street. The wait for answers was shorter than I expected. The very next morning, my phone alerted me to motion detected on my front lawn. The footage showed a large black SUV deliberately swinging wide on the corner and cutting directly across my property. There was no mistaking it. This was intentional. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to Diane Winters from 3 houses down, a woman the neighborhood had collectively nicknamed Karen behind her back. Diane had a reputation for filing complaints with the HOA over infractions as minor as a garbage bin left at the curb, until evening or holiday decorations that remained up a day past the association's arbitrary deadline. Now I watched in disbelief as she casually drove across my lawn, saving perhaps 5 seconds on her morning commute while destroying my property. That evening, I waited until I saw her return home, then walked down to her house. I approached the conversation with civility, introducing myself as her neighbor and mentioning that my security camera had captured her vehicle crossing my lawn. I even showed her pictures of the damage on my phone. Her reaction left me speechless. Rather than apologizing, Diane scoffed, waving her hand dismissively as if shooing away an insect. "That little strip, that barely counts as a lawn," she said, looking at me as if I were being unreasonable. "Besides, everyone knows that area between the sidewalk and street is not really private property." When I politely corrected her, explaining that I did in fact own and maintain that land, her eyes narrowed. "Well, if we are going to be so concerned with rules," she said with a tight smile, "perhaps I should mention to the HOA that your mailbox appears to be half an inch taller than regulation height. I have been meaning to report that." I stood there stunned by the implied threat. Before I could respond, she glanced at her watch with exaggerated impatience. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have an HOA committee meeting to attend." She climbed into her SUV and started the engine, but instead of backing directly into the street, she deliberately pulled forward across the corner of my lawn, maintaining eye contact with me through her window as she did so. The message was clear. This was not a matter of convenience, this was a power play. And in that moment, I knew conventional approaches would not resolve this situation. The next day, I documented the damaged areas with photographs, measuring the depth of the tire ruts and calculating the cost of repairs. Armed with this evidence, I tried once more to reason with Diane, hoping that a more formal approach might succeed where neighborly discussion had failed. This time, I found her pruning roses in her front yard, clipboard nearby as she presumably looked for violations to report. When she saw me approaching, her expression hardened. I presented my case calmly, showing her the documented damage and offering a compromise. I would install small decorative markers along my property line if she would agree to respect the boundary. Her response was immediate and hostile. She alternated between outright denial and justification, first claiming she had never driven on my lawn, then insisting that if she had, it was because my excessive landscaping made the corner too tight for a proper turn. When I showed her the time-stamped video from my security camera, her demeanor shifted dramatically. "You have been recording me? That is harassment and invasion of privacy," she exclaimed, her voice rising to ensure any neighbors within earshot would hear. "I could call the police right now and file charges against you for illegal surveillance." Maintaining my composure, I explained that recording my own property was perfectly legal. This only seemed to fuel her indignation. She snatched up her clipboard and pointed a manicured finger at me. "We will see what the HOA has to say about this. I am on the board, you know." This revelation explained much about her confidence. That evening, I drafted a formal complaint to the Homeowners Association, attaching photographs, video evidence, and an itemized estimate for lawn repairs. I received a response 3 days later, a form letter stating that after careful consideration, the board had determined that the complaint did not merit action as the damage was minimal and possibly caused by normal wear and tear near a public right-of-way. The letter was signed by the HOA president, but I had little doubt who had influenced the decision. My next step was the local police department. The officer who took my report was sympathetic but not particularly helpful. "This is technically trespassing and property damage," he acknowledged. "But with the values involved, it would be classified as a civil matter. You could take her to small claims court, but honestly, the filing fees would probably exceed the cost of repairs." He suggested I install physical barriers or signage to clarify property boundaries. Taking his advice, I installed a row of small decorative rocks along my property line. They were attractive, consistent with neighborhood aesthetics, and sent a clear message. This is not a driveway. My satisfaction was short-lived. The following morning, I discovered several of the rocks had been moved aside, creating a gap just wide enough for an SUV to pass through. The tire tracks beyond them were deeper than ever, as if someone had deliberately accelerated across my lawn. Over the next 2 weeks, this became a bizarre battle of wills. Each evening, I would replace and reinforce the boundary markers. Each morning, I would find them disturbed and new damage to my lawn. If anything, Diane seemed to be driving across my property more frequently, transforming what had begun as a shortcut into an act of deliberate defiance. Each time we crossed paths, she would offer the same tight smile that never reached her eyes, a smile that said she knew exactly what she was doing and believed herself untouchable. As frustration mounted, I began researching local ordinances and property laws with increasing determination. I spent evenings at my computer, searching for precedents and solutions while watching through my window as Diane's SUV crossed my lawn with impunity. It became clear that conventional approaches, neighborly discussion, HOA complaints, police reports, simple physical barriers, had failed. If I wanted to protect my property, I would need to think more creatively. The realization settled over me like a weight, and then, strangely, lifted as a plan began to form in my mind. Diane might believe she had all the power in this situation, but she had overlooked something important. This was my property, and I had rights she could not simply drive over. My research into property law yielded several important discoveries. First, the strip of land between the sidewalk and street, often called the verge, parking strip, or tree lawn, was indeed my property, though it was subject to certain easements for utilities and public use. These easements did not include the right for private citizens to drive across it as a shortcut. Second, as the property owner, I had the right to place reasonable obstacles to prevent trespassing, so long as these obstacles did not create hazards for legitimate use of the easement. Finally, I learned that in my state, the doctrine of attractive nuisance did not apply to adults knowingly trespassing on clearly marked private property. Armed with this legal knowledge, I contacted a friend who practiced real estate law. Over coffee, he confirmed my findings and offered additional insights. "You need to build a case with clear documentation," he advised. Make sure your property boundaries are clearly marked, post appropriate signage, and continue recording incidents. Most importantly, any measures you take to protect your property must be reasonable and proportionate, designed to prevent trespass, not to cause harm or damage. This conversation sparked an idea for a multi-layered approach that would protect my lawn while ensuring Diane faced consequences for her actions. I began by mapping out my property lines using the official survey included in my home purchase documents. Next, I visited neighbors who had experienced similar issues with Diane, carefully documenting their stories and building a comprehensive picture of her pattern of entitled behavior throughout the community. The conversations were revealing. The retired couple 2 doors down described how Diane had reported them to the HOA for a bird feeder that supposedly attracted nuisance wildlife. The young family across the street had received multiple citations for children's toys visible in their yard. The pattern was clear. Diane weaponized HOA regulations against neighbors while considering herself above the very rules she enforced. What surprised me most was how many people shared their stories once someone was willing to listen. There was a palpable sense of relief in the community at the possibility of finally addressing the issue. My plan took shape. I would create a comprehensive security system combining documentation, physical deterrence, and community support. Each element would be completely legal and designed not to cause harm, but to create unavoidable consequences for trespassing. The goal was not merely to protect my lawn, but to address the broader issue of Diane's reign of entitled behavior in our neighborhood. With my strategy outlined, I spent the next week gathering supplies. I purchased an upgraded security camera system that would capture multiple angles with timestamp and GPS data. I ordered specialized lawn edging that appeared decorative, but contained hidden, robust metal anchors buried deep in the soil. I selected attractive, no trespassing and private property signs that complied with local ordinances. I also invested in a motion-activated sprinkler system that could detect vehicle weight and a special colored mulch that would clearly show disturbance and transfer to vehicle tires if driven over. As I collected these materials, I felt a growing sense of anticipation. For weeks, I had been reacting to Diane's provocations, always on the defensive. Now I was taking back control of the situation. Each component of my plan was carefully selected to be both effective and entirely legal. The trap I was setting would be impossible to ignore or dismiss, and Diane would finally face consequences for her actions. The weekend Diane left town for a conference presented the perfect opportunity to implement my plan. It was time to turn the tables. I began the installation early Saturday morning. My first step was upgrading the security system, mounting cameras at strategic points to capture multiple angles of my property. Each camera was connected to cloud storage and set to record continuously, with motion-activated alerts sent directly to my phone. I installed the system openly, making no attempt to hide the cameras. They were a statement in themselves. Next came the specialized lawn edging. I carefully measured and placed the decorative border along my property line, particularly in the corner area Diane consistently used as her shortcut. The edging looked like ordinary landscaping, but concealed rigid metal anchors that extended deep into the soil, creating an invisible barrier that could potentially damage a vehicle driving over it. This was perhaps the most ambitious part of my setup, requiring precise installation to ensure it was both effective and legally defensible. Throughout the morning, neighbors walked by, curious about my intensive landscaping project. I explained my situation openly, and several offered to serve as witnesses if needed. Their support reinforced my resolve. This was not just about my lawn anymore. It was about standing up to a neighborhood bully who had gone unchecked for too long. By mid-afternoon, I had installed the signage. No trespassing and no driving on lawn signs positioned prominently at the property boundary. I photographed their placement and asked 2 neighbors to witness and sign a statement confirming when the signs were installed. Next came the motion-activated sprinkler system, calibrated to detect the weight of a vehicle but not pedestrians, and positioned to spray directly at the path Diane typically took across my lawn. The final touch was a layer of specially colored mulch spread around the property border. The mulch contained a non-toxic but highly visible dye that would transfer to tires and show clear evidence of any vehicle crossing the boundary. I watered it thoroughly to ensure it would bind to anything passing over it. By Sunday evening, everything was in place. From the street, my yard looked simply like it had received an attractive upgrade: new edging, fresh mulch, and subtle landscaping improvements. Only a closer inspection would reveal the carefully engineered trap lying in wait. I tested all systems once more before turning in for the night, setting my alarm early to ensure I would be ready for Diane's return. Monday morning arrived with perfect clarity, the kind of crisp spring day that normally would have lifted my spirits. I made coffee and positioned myself at my home office desk, which I had temporarily relocated to provide a clear view of the street while I worked. My laptop displayed both my work projects and a small window showing the live feed from my security cameras. The waiting was the hardest part, but I knew Diane's routine by now. She left for work at precisely 8:15 a.m., cutting across my lawn at 8:17 a.m. as she turned onto the main road. At 8:14 a.m., I saw her SUV back out of her driveway. My heart rate increased as I watched her approach the corner where my property began. Right on schedule, instead of making a proper turn, she swung wide and aimed directly for the shortcut across my lawn. The moment her front tires crossed my property line, multiple elements of my trap activated simultaneously. The motion-activated sprinkler system engaged with a powerful spray, hitting the side of her vehicle with an impressive arc of water. Startled, Diane accelerated, which only made matters worse as her tires caught on the hidden lawn edging. There was a distinctive scraping sound as the metal anchors connected with the undercarriage of her SUV. The colored mulch did its job perfectly, splashing up to mark her tires with unmistakable evidence. Most satisfyingly, every moment was captured in high-definition video from multiple angles. Diane slammed on her brakes, bringing the SUV to a halt half on my lawn, half on the street. She emerged from the vehicle like a force of nature, soaking wet on one side, face contorted with rage. Water dripped from her carefully styled hair as she stormed toward my front door, leaving mulch-stained footprints across the sidewalk. I opened the door before she could pound on it, maintaining a calm expression that contrasted sharply with her fury. "Good morning, Diane. Is there a problem?" I asked, as if genuinely confused by her presence. What followed was a tirade of accusations and threats. She demanded compensation for damage to her vehicle, claimed I had created a dangerous hazard, and promised lawsuits that would take everything I owned. Spittle flew from her lips as she gesticulated wildly toward her SUV, which now sat awkwardly with one wheel caught on my lawn edging, blue-tinted mulch clearly visible on the tires. I waited for her to pause for breath before speaking. "Diane, you were driving across my private property despite clearly posted signs prohibiting exactly that action. Everything installed on my lawn is standard landscaping material on my own property. I am sorry if you damaged your vehicle while trespassing, but that responsibility lies with you." My calm response only fueled her rage. "You did this deliberately. You set a trap. This is criminal. I am calling the police right now." She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking with anger. "I think that is an excellent idea," I replied, surprising her. "In fact, I encourage you to do so. While we wait for them to arrive, would you like to review the video footage of you repeatedly driving across my lawn over the past 3 weeks? I have it all documented, including this morning's incident from multiple angles." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face as she realized the extent of my preparation. Her eyes darted to the visible security cameras, the prominent "No trespassing" signs, and back to her vehicle with its mulch-stained tires. Nevertheless, she stabbed at her phone with a manicured finger, too committed to her outrage to back down. "Yes, I need to report property damage and a dangerous hazard," she said into the phone, her voice carrying across the neighborhood. As she described the situation to the dispatcher, conveniently omitting that she had been driving across my lawn at the time, I noticed several neighbors emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. The police arrived within 15 minutes, during which time Diane had worked herself into an even greater state of indignation, packing back and forth on the sidewalk, and documenting what she called evidence by taking photos of my lawn edging and sprinkler system. Two officers approached, one male and one female, both wearing expressions that suggested this was not the first neighborly dispute of their morning. The female officer addressed Diane first, as she had been the one to call. "Ma'am, I understand you've reported property damage to your vehicle." Diane launched into her version of events, describing how she had been innocently driving when my hidden traps damaged her SUV. She demanded they arrest me immediately for creating hazardous conditions and intentionally damaging her property. The officers listened impassively, occasionally glancing at me as if gauging my reaction. When Diane finally paused, the male officer turned to me. "Sir, do you have anything to add to this?" "Yes, officer," I replied calmly. "I have extensive documentation of Ms. Winters repeatedly driving across my lawn despite multiple requests for her to stop. I installed standard landscaping features on my property and clearly posted signs prohibiting trespassing and driving on the lawn. I would be happy to show you the video evidence of this morning's incident as well as the previous occasions." I retrieved my tablet and showed them the footage. First, the compilation of Diane's previous incursions across my lawn, then this morning's incident from multiple angles. The evidence was undeniable. The video clearly showed Diane deliberately driving across my lawn despite visible signage, the sprinkler activating only after her vehicle had crossed onto my property, and her tires catching on the lawn edging as she accelerated. The female officer turned to Diane. "Ma'am, can you explain why you were driving across private property clearly marked with no trespassing signs?" Diane's explanation became increasingly convoluted as she attempted to justify her actions. She claimed the corner was too tight for a proper turn, then suggested that the property line was unclear, then insisted that everyone drives that way. When the officer pointed out the clear property markers and signage visible in the video, Diane switched tactics, claiming I had installed the signs only after she had established a right-of-way by consistent use. As Diane's explanations grew more desperate, neighbors began to gather on the sidewalk, drawn by the police presence and raised voices. To my surprise, several approached the officers voluntarily, offering their own accounts of Diane's entitled behavior and HOA abuses. Mr. Jenkins from across the street described how Diane had reported his daughter's basketball hoop within hours of installation. Mrs. Rodriguez detailed receiving multiple violations for garden gnomes that Diane deemed tasteless ornaments. Each story painted a consistent picture of petty tyranny and selective rule enforcement. The officers conferred briefly before addressing Diane again. "Ms. Winters, based on the evidence we've seen, you are clearly trespassing on private property. The homeowner has every right to protect their property with reasonable measures, which these appear to be. The signage is proper, the landscaping features are standard and visible, and the sprinkler system is activated by motion on private property." Diane's face flushed deeper. He deliberately set a trap. He should be charged with creating a hazard. The male officer shook his head. "Ma'am, nothing here constitutes a trap in the legal sense. These are normal landscaping features clearly visible on private property with proper signage. If anything, you could potentially face charges for trespassing and property damage to the lawn." The mention of potential charges against her had an immediate effect. Diane's indignation reached new heights as she realized the tables had turned. "This is outrageous. Do you know who I am? I am on the HOA board. I will have both of your badges for this." The female officer remained unimpressed. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. You're welcome to file a complaint through proper channels, but threatening officers won't help your situation." As Diane continued her tirade, a silver sedan pulled up to the curb. A distinguished older man emerged, Charles Whitman, the HOA president, whom I recognized from community meetings but had never spoken with directly. Apparently, several concerned neighbors had contacted him about the disturbance. Charles approached with the cautious expression of someone walking into a volatile situation. "What seems to be the problem here, officers? I am the Homeowners Association president for this community." Before either officer could respond, Diane rushed to Charles, clearly expecting an ally. "Charles, thank goodness you are here. This person has installed dangerous traps on their lawn that damaged my car, and now the police are taking their side. Charles looked confused until I stepped forward, introducing myself and briefly explaining the situation. I offered to show him the same video evidence I had presented to the officers. As he watched the footage on my tablet, his expression changed from confusion to concern to something approaching anger. "Diane, you drove across their lawn, after they had posted clear signage prohibiting it," he asked, his tone indicating this was not the first issue with Diane that had crossed his desk. "It was barely on the edge, and they deliberately installed that metal edging to damage my car," Diane protested, her voice rising again. Charles turned to the officers. "Do you consider the landscaping features to be hazardous or illegal in any way?" "No, sir," the female officer replied. "They're standard landscaping materials properly installed on private property. The homeowner has clearly marked the property boundaries and posted appropriate signage." Charles's professional demeanor remained intact, but his displeasure was evident. "Diane, this is clearly a violation of our community standards regarding respect for private property. I believe we need to discuss your position on the HOA committee at our next meeting." The blood drained from Diane's face as she realized her HOA power base was threatened. "Charles, you cannot be serious. For this minor incident, I have served on that board for 5 years. This does not appear to be a minor or isolated incident," Charles replied, gesturing to the gathering of neighbors who had been sharing their own experiences. "There will be an emergency board meeting tomorrow evening to address these concerns. I suggest you prepare to answer some difficult questions." With the situation diffused by the police and HOA president, Diane had no choice but to retreat. She returned to her vehicle, which a neighbor had helped move off my lawn edging, and drove away with as much dignity as she could muster, still muttering about lawsuits and injustice. As she turned the corner, I noticed she made an exaggeratedly wide turn to avoid driving near my property, a small but satisfying victory. Charles approached me as the officers prepared to leave. "I apologize for dismissing your previous complaint," he said quietly. "I see now there was a pattern we failed to address. Rest assured, this will be handled appropriately at the board level." As the crowd dispersed and I returned to my home office, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and exhaustion. The confrontation had been intense, but the evidence had spoken for itself. More importantly, the community had finally found its voice against someone who had abused her position for too long. I spent the rest of the day fielding text messages and calls from neighbors, many thanking me for standing up to Diane, and some offering to attend the emergency HOA meeting to share their own experiences. What had begun as a simple matter of protecting my lawn had catalyzed a long-overdue reckoning within our community. Word spread quickly throughout Oakwood Estates. By evening, my phone was constantly buzzing with messages from neighbors sharing their own Diane stories and offering support. Most surprising were the messages from residents I had never spoken with, living in sections of the neighborhood I rarely visited. It seemed Diane's influence had extended far beyond our immediate vicinity, creating an atmosphere of intimidation that had silenced many homeowners. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. the following evening at the community center. I arrived 20 minutes early to find the parking lot already filling with cars. Inside, the normally empty rows of chairs were quickly being claimed by residents, many of whom nodded to me in recognition as I entered. By the time Charles called the meeting to order, it was standing room only, an unprecedented turnout for an HOA meeting that typically attracted only the most dedicated community members. Charles began by explaining the purpose of the emergency session, to address concerns about potential abuse of HOA authority and to review the conduct of board member Diane Winters. He then invited residents to share their experiences, emphasizing that this was an opportunity for community voices to be heard without fear of retribution. What followed was nothing short of remarkable. One by one, neighbors approached the microphone to describe their interactions with Diane. A young couple detailed how they had been reported for violations within days of moving in, before they had even received their copy of the HOA regulations. An elderly widow explained how Diane had filed complaints about her grandson's tricycle being visible in the driveway during his weekend visits. A healthcare worker described receiving violation notices for leaving his car parked on the street during overnight shifts at the hospital, despite having obtained proper permission. The pattern was clear and consistent: selective enforcement, personal vendettas, and a brazen disregard for the community standards she claimed to uphold. When it was my turn to speak, I focused not on the lawn incident specifically, but on the broader impact of allowing such behavior to continue unchecked. What happened on my lawn is simply a symptom of a larger problem, I explained. When we empower individuals who view rules as weapons rather than frameworks for community harmony, we all suffer. I am not here seeking punishment, but accountability and change. Diane arrived late, entering the room during another resident's testimony. Her usual confidence had vanished, replaced by a defensive posture as she took a seat at the board table. When given her opportunity to respond, she attempted to dismiss the complaints as misunderstandings and exaggerations, suggesting that she was simply fulfilling her duty to maintain neighborhood standards. Her explanations rang hollow against the mountain of consistent testimony. The board deliberated publicly, a departure from their usual protocol that Charles explained was necessary for transparency given the circumstances. Their decision was unanimous. Diane would be removed from her position on the HOA committee effective immediately, and new guidelines would be implemented for reporting and addressing violations, including a peer review process to prevent similar abuses in the future. Additionally, formal warnings were issued regarding Diane's property violations and trespassing incidents, with the stipulation that any further violations could result in significant fines. Charles concluded the meeting by offering an official apology to residents whose complaints had been dismissed or handled inappropriately, acknowledging that the board had failed in its duty to serve the community fairly. As the meeting adjourned, there was a palpable sense of relief in the room, as if a weight had been lifted from the collective shoulders of Oakwood Estates. Neighbors lingered in small groups, exchanging contact information and making plans for community improvements. I received countless handshakes and thank yous, along with good-natured jokes about my lawn trap that had triggered this long-overdue reckoning. The most significant outcome came 2 days later: a certified letter from the HOA requiring Diane to pay for the damage to my lawn, with the explicit warning that failure to comply would result in a lien against her property. The amount was modest, but the principle was enormous. Consequences had finally reached someone who had long believed herself above them. In the weeks that followed, the transformation within our neighborhood was remarkable. Communication improved as residents felt empowered to address issues directly rather than suffering in silence. The HOA established a new online portal where violations could be reported transparently, with all parties notified and given fair opportunity to respond. Community projects that had stalled for years suddenly found renewed support and momentum. Diane maintained a noticeably low profile. The loss of her HOA position seemed to have deflated much of her entitlement. Her SUV now took conspicuously wide turns at every corner, and she avoided eye contact when our paths crossed at the local grocery store. While she never offered a direct apology, that would have required an acknowledgement of wrongdoing her pride would not allow. Her behavior changed dramatically. Sometimes, actions speak louder than words. As for my lawn, it recovered fully by midsummer. I replaced the temporary measures with permanent but attractive stone markers along the property line, creating a boundary that was both functional and aesthetically pleasing. Neighbors often commented on the improvement, some jokingly asking if the sprinkler system remained active. It did not. Its purpose had been served. 6 months after the incident, I stood on my front porch, coffee in hand, watching a moving truck pull up across the street. New neighbors were arriving, a young family with small children. As they unloaded their belongings, I prepared a basket of cookies and neighborhood information to welcome them properly. Crossing my pristine, undisturbed lawn toward their driveway, I reflected on how a simple act of standing up against entitled behavior had created positive change throughout our community. The challenges of homeownership are many, but so are the rewards. My lawn was more than just grass. It represented my right to peaceful enjoyment of property I had worked hard to obtain. Defending that right had required creativity, courage, and a perfectly legal trap. More importantly, it had sparked a community renaissance that benefited everyone. Well, almost everyone. As I extended my hand to welcome my new neighbors, I noticed Diane pulling out of her driveway, carefully navigating around my property marker. Our eyes met briefly, and for the first time, she looked away first. Sometimes justice comes not in grand courthouse dramas, but in small moments of accountability and changed behavior. My lawn had never looked better.